Every morning, I woke up with the strange feeling that I hadn't really been there the day before. It wasn't just the usual grogginess you get after a bad night's sleep. It was something deeper, like I had been physically present, but emotionally absent. The routine had become suffocating. Waking up at 7 a.m., getting ready, having my coffee, and heading out to a job where I was slowly vanishing into the background. I worked in a non-profit organization, doing crucial behind-the-scenes tasks that kept everything running smoothly, but somehow no one seemed to notice. I was just a cog in the machine, vital but unseen. I'd been at the organization for 3 years, and by now I should have been used to the routine. I should have accepted the fact that no one really cared about the little things I did. But I couldn't. The irony was that the work itself was interesting. I was deeply passionate about the cause we served. The problem wasn't the work, it was the people around me. The leadership, especially Todd, our manager, was a constant reminder of everything that was wrong with this organization. Todd had an uncanny ability to talk in circles about grand ideas and initiatives, but when it came to the actual execution, he was nowhere to be found. Most days, I was left alone to handle things. I kept the organization afloat, solved problems no one even knew existed, and dealt with the day-to-day chaos. Meanwhile, Todd spent his time in meetings, holding long discussions about strategy and team collaboration, all while avoiding any real decision-making. The worst part, he'd never recognized the work I did. Not once did I hear thanks or good job for staying late to fix problems. It felt as if the longer I worked, the less I mattered. And then there was the feeling of invisibility. The more I contributed, the more invisible I became. Colleagues would pass by without even acknowledging my presence, and Todd, well, he was too busy talking about the big picture to care about the small details that made the whole thing function. The constant disconnect between what I did and how others saw it was starting to weigh on me. I found myself becoming resentful, frustrated, even bitter at times. And the worst part, I couldn't even talk to anyone about it. There was no one to confide in. Everyone was too busy pretending that everything was fine. It all came to a head one afternoon. We were in a team meeting, and Todd was once again going on about how we needed to leverage our resources better and align our goals with the greater mission. It was the same speech he gave every time, only with different buzzwords sprinkled in. When it was my turn to speak, I suggested a simple change in our approach that could improve efficiency in our outreach efforts. I wasn't asking for a lot, just a small adjustment that could make a big difference. But Todd just waved his hand dismissively, as if I had suggested we burn the whole place down. That was when I realized something. No matter how much I tried, no matter how hard I worked, nothing would ever change unless I did something drastic. Todd and the rest of the leadership team weren't interested in listening to anyone below them. They had their own agenda, and I was just a background character in their story. That afternoon, as I sat at my desk, I made a decision. I would stop playing their game. I would stop giving my all for an organization that would never acknowledge my efforts. The realization hit me hard, and for the first time in months, I felt a surge of clarity. The next few days were a blur. I went through the motions at work, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about what I needed to do. I wasn't going to quit immediately. No, that wouldn't be the point. I had to show them that they needed me, that they had been taking me for granted. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I wasn't just going to walk out the door in frustration, I was going to do it on my terms, with dignity. It wasn't going to be an angry exit, it was going to be a statement. And I had to wait for the right moment. That moment would come soon enough. I knew it. The longer I stayed, the more I realized that I had been undervalued, and it was time to make sure everyone knew who had been the driving force behind all the work they took for granted. I wasn't going to let myself fade into obscurity any longer. I would make sure that the next chapter of my life was one where I was seen, heard, and respected. The question was no longer whether I should leave, but how I would make my departure a lesson for those who had failed to see my worth. But for now, I sat quietly in my office, watching the world go on as it always did. The following days felt strangely detached, like I was floating above the ground, watching everything unfold without truly participating. I had made my decision, but there was a strange calmness to the waiting. I wasn't angry anymore, nor was I desperate to leave. This wasn't about an immediate escape, it was about taking control. I had spent too long being invisible, and now it was time to reclaim what had been lost. My sense of value, my dignity, and my power to shape my own future. I had no intention of quietly fading away. Instead, I would leave with purpose, ensuring that my absence was felt. Todd and the rest of the management team went on, oblivious to the brewing storm. It was business as usual. Todd continued his endless speeches about vision and strategy, his words floating through the air like empty balloons, slowly deflating with every passing second. It became almost comical watching him prance around, talking in circles while completely neglecting the real work happening beneath him. He was so preoccupied with his image, constantly tweaking his narrative to seem more competent than he actually was, that he couldn't see the growing frustration within the ranks of the people doing the real work. The other team members weren't much better. Most of them were just going through the motions, much like I had been. There was no passion, no energy. People clocked in and out, but there was no drive to change, no desire to make things better. It wasn't that they didn't care, it was that they had long since given up caring. They had adapted to the dysfunctional system, and now they were just stuck in it, surviving rather than thriving. I couldn't blame them for that, but I knew that I couldn't stay in the same stagnant place anymore. I was done surviving. I wanted to live. And to do that, I had to leave this behind. I spent a lot of time in the following days reflecting on what I had learned during my time at the organization. The truth was, I had grown a lot. Despite everything, the disrespect, the long hours, the lack of recognition, I had gained experience that would serve me well in the future. But there was one key lesson that I could no longer ignore. My worth was not tied to my ability to sacrifice for an ungrateful system. The work I did was meaningful, but I was the one who had to value it first. No one else would do it for me. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, the moment came. It wasn't a grand event, nor was it an outburst. It was, in fact, quite simple. Todd was in his office, as usual, poring over documents that didn't matter. I walked up to his door, knocked lightly, and entered. He looked up, startled for a moment, as if he hadn't expected anyone to approach him directly. I closed the door behind me and took a seat across from him. "Todd, I've made a decision," I said, my voice steady, without any of the anger that had once simmered beneath the surface. He looked at me, his expression a mix of curiosity and mild irritation. "What decision?" "I'm leaving," I said plainly. "I've decided it's time to move on." There was a brief silence. Todd blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Wait, what? You're leaving us? But we need you here. You're well. You're an important part of this team." I nodded, not feeling the need to elaborate on how little I had been recognized. "I've been important for a long time, Todd, but I'm not going to keep working for a system that doesn't acknowledge or value what I do. I can't keep sacrificing for something that won't ever appreciate it." Todd frowned, clearly scrambling to come up with the right words. "Look, I get it. You've been doing a lot of work, and we all appreciate it. I mean, you've really been keeping things running. But this isn't the right way to go about it. You can't just walk away from everything we've built." "It's not about walking away from what's been built," I said, standing up. "It's about walking away from a place that doesn't know how to appreciate what's been done. I've been giving more than I've been getting, and I can't keep doing that." I could see the confusion on his face as he tried to process what was happening. He was a man who had always believed that his words were enough, that the illusion of leadership could carry him. But now, in the face of the truth, he was left with nothing to say. He wasn't the one who had been making it work. It had always been the people behind the scenes, like me, who did the real work. "I wish you would reconsider," Todd said quietly, but his voice lacked conviction. I knew it wasn't because he cared about me. It was because he knew my departure would leave a hole. But I wasn't interested in staying for the sake of filling his empty spaces. I smiled slightly, nodding. "Good luck with everything, Todd. You'll need it." I walked out of his office, feeling the weight of my decision lifting off my shoulders. It was done. There was no going back. I had taken control of my life, and now it was time to move on to something better. Something where my skills would be seen, where my work would matter. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done with being invisible. I was done being the person who was always there, always working, but never noticed. The next chapter of my life was going to be mine to write. The following days felt strangely detached, like I was floating above the ground, watching everything unfold without truly participating. I had made my decision, but there was a strange calmness to the waiting. I wasn't angry anymore, nor was I desperate to leave. This wasn't about an immediate escape, it was about taking control. I had spent too long being invisible, and now it was time to reclaim what had been lost. My sense of value, my dignity, and my power to shape my own future. I had no intention of quietly fading away. Instead, I would leave with purpose, ensuring that my absence was felt. Todd and the rest of the management team went on, oblivious to the brewing storm. It was business as usual. Todd continued his endless speeches about vision and strategy, his words floating through the air like empty balloons, slowly deflating with every passing second. It became almost comical, watching him prance around, talking in circles while completely neglecting the real work happening beneath him. He was so preoccupied with his image, constantly tweaking his narrative to seem more competent than he actually was, that he couldn't see the growing frustration within the ranks of the people doing the real work. The other team members weren't much better. Most of them were just going through the motions, much like I had been. There was no passion, no energy. People clocked in and out, but there was no drive to change, no desire to make things better. It wasn't that they didn't care, it was that they had long since given up caring. They had adapted to the dysfunctional system, and now they were just stuck in it, surviving rather than thriving. I couldn't blame them for that, but I knew that I couldn't stay in the same stagnant place anymore. I was done surviving. I wanted to live. And to do that, I had to leave this behind. I spent a lot of time in the following days reflecting on what I had learned during my time at the organization. The truth was, I had grown a lot. Despite everything, the disrespect, the long hours, the lack of recognition, I had gained experience that would serve me well in the future. But there was one key lesson that I could no longer ignore. My worth was not tied to my ability to sacrifice for an ungrateful system. The work I did was meaningful, but I was the one who had to value it first. No one else would do it for me. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, the moment came. It wasn't a grand event, nor was it an outburst. It was, in fact, quite simple. Todd was in his office, as usual, poring over documents that didn't matter. I walked up to his door, knocked lightly, and entered. He looked up, startled for a moment, as if he hadn't expected anyone to approach him directly. I closed the door behind me and took a seat across from him. "Todd, I've made a decision," I said, my voice steady, without any of the anger that had once simmered beneath the surface. He looked at me, his expression a mix of curiosity and mild irritation. "What decision?" "I'm leaving," I said plainly. "I've decided it's time to move on." There was a brief silence. Todd blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Wait, what? You're leaving us? But we need you here. You're an important part of this team." I nodded, not feeling the need to elaborate on how little I had been recognized. "I've been important for a long time, Todd. But I'm not going to keep working for a system that doesn't acknowledge or value what I do. I can't keep sacrificing for something that won't ever appreciate it." Todd frowned, clearly scrambling to come up with the right words. "Look, I get it. You've been doing a lot of work, and we all appreciate it. I mean, you've really been keeping things running. But this isn't the right way to go about it. You can't just walk away from everything we've built." "It's not about walking away from what's been built," I said, standing up. "It's about walking away from a place that doesn't know how to appreciate what's been done. I've been giving more than I've been getting, and I can't keep doing that." I could see the confusion on his face as he tried to process what was happening. He was a man who had always believed that his words were enough, that the illusion of leadership could carry him. But now, in the face of the truth, he was left with nothing to say. He wasn't the one who had been making it work. It had always been the people behind the scenes, like me, who did the real work. "I wish you would reconsider," Todd said quietly, but his voice lacked conviction. I knew it wasn't because he cared about me. It was because he knew my departure would leave a hole. But I wasn't interested in staying for the sake of filling his empty spaces. I smiled slightly, nodding. "Good luck with everything, Todd. You'll need it." I walked out of his office, feeling the weight of my decision lifting off my shoulders. It was done. There was no going back. I had taken control of my life, and now it was time to move on to something better. Something where my skills would be seen, where my work would matter. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done with being invisible. I was done being the person who was always there, always working, but never noticed. The next chapter of my life was going to be mine to write. The following days passed in a strange, surreal blur, like the calm before a storm. I had made my decision, and now I was just waiting for the moment to come. There was a strange sense of peace that settled over me. It wasn't anger or resentment anymore, it was acceptance. I had seen enough to understand that nothing would ever change unless I made it change. And as I sat at my desk, answering emails, organizing reports, and doing everything I had done for years, I couldn't help but feel the quiet certainty growing within me. I was done. I couldn't keep doing this. Not for another year, not for another month, not for another day. Todd and the rest of the leadership team went about their business as usual, completely unaware of the shift happening around them. Todd spent most of his days in meetings, giving the same speeches about vision, teamwork, and strategy, but none of it ever amounted to anything. I could feel the gap between his words and the reality of the organization widening. He was disconnected from the day-to-day operations, from the people who actually made things happen. I had been the one doing the work all along, solving problems, keeping everything together, but he never saw it. None of them did. The rest of the team seemed to be in the same place, tired, worn out, and resigned to the fact that nothing would ever improve. They were just going through the motions. It wasn't that they didn't care, but I could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the way they had stopped trying to change things. They had learned to survive within the dysfunction, to accept it as the norm. They had given up. But I hadn't. I couldn't. Not anymore. I spent my days making sure everything was in place for my departure, preparing for the inevitable conversation with Todd. I had no idea how he would react, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to beg for anything. I had given everything I had to that place, and it had never been enough. I had given my time, my energy, my heart, and still I had been nothing more than a nameless face, a background player in a story that wasn't mine. It was time for me to write my own story. The day I decided to talk to Todd came faster than I expected. It was just another Wednesday afternoon, but I knew it would be the day everything changed. I walked into his office, my heart pounding in my chest, not from fear, but from anticipation. Todd was sitting at his desk, his eyes glued to his computer screen. I knocked once before entering, and he looked up, startled. "Hey, what's up?" he said, his voice too casual, too distracted. "I need to talk to you," I said, keeping my voice calm. "It's important." He raised an eyebrow but gestured for me to sit down. I took a deep breath and sat across from him, watching the way he fiddled with the pen, waiting for me to speak. He clearly wasn't expecting what was coming. "Todd, I've decided to leave," I said flatly. The words hung in the air, and for a moment Todd didn't say anything. His eyes widened slightly, a look of confusion crossing his face. "What do you mean, leave?" he asked, frowning. "You're leaving the team. Why? You've been a key part of everything we've done here." I nodded, but there was no feeling in the response. "I've been a part of it, yes, but I'm not going to keep working for a system that doesn't recognize the work I do. It's time for me to move on." He sat back in his chair, looking genuinely stunned. "But you're a vital part of the organization. We need you here. You can't just walk away from everything we've built." "I've already built everything I'm going to," I replied. "You've been building something that's not real. You talk about strategy, about collaboration, but when it comes down to it, you don't care about the people who are actually making it happen. I've had enough of being invisible." Todd's face twisted in frustration. "Look, I understand that you're upset, but you can't just throw away everything we've worked for. You're a big part of this team. You're important to what we do." "Maybe I was important," I said, standing up, "but I'm not going to stay and pretend that any of this matters. I've done everything I can, and I'm not going to keep sacrificing for something that doesn't recognize my value." There was a long silence. Todd stared at me, clearly struggling to come up with the right response. I could see him scrambling to make sense of it, but there was nothing left to say. I had made my decision, and nothing he said could change it. "Are you sure this is what you want?" he finally asked, his voice softer now, though there was no real sincerity behind it. "Yes," I replied firmly, "I'm sure. I'm done here." Without another word, I turned and walked out of his office, the weight of my decision finally lifting. It was done. I had taken control of my own fate. The world outside the office seemed clearer now, the possibilities endless. I had no idea what came next, but I knew one thing. I was no longer bound by a system that didn't value me. The rest of the world would see me for who I truly was. The journey ahead would be mine to write. The days after I left the office were a whirlwind, a strange combination of relief and uncertainty. I had done what I needed to do. I had walked away from a job that had drained me, and now the world outside seemed vast and full of possibilities. But as much as I tried to savor my newfound freedom, there was a lingering feeling of unease. The truth was, I didn't know exactly what came next. I had spent so long being defined by my work, by the tasks I performed, that I wasn't sure who I was outside of that role. I had spent years making sure the organization functioned, but now I had to figure out how to function on my own terms. At first, it was oddly quiet. I spent the first few days at home catching up on things I had put off for years, reading books, taking long walks, and just allowing myself to breathe. The weight of the daily grind had lifted, but in its place there was a sense of being lost. I knew I couldn't stay idle for long. The world kept turning, and so did I. I had skills, knowledge, and drive, but where would I apply them? Who would appreciate them this time? Then an email arrived. It was from a former colleague, someone I had worked with briefly during a project we'd both been involved in years ago. She was now working at a company I had always admired, one that had a reputation for valuing its employees, one that didn't just talk about collaboration but actively fostered it. The email was simple, yet it sent a wave of excitement through me. "We're looking for someone with your skill set. Would you be interested in a conversation?" I stared at the screen for what felt like hours. The opportunity felt almost too good to be true, but in that moment I realized something. This was my chance to prove that I was not invisible, that I wasn't defined by my old role, by the work I had done in the shadows, but by my potential, my ability to grow and adapt. This was the validation I had been waiting for. I hadn't been asking for praise. I had been asking for the chance to show what I could really do. And now I had that chance. I quickly responded, setting up a call with her for the next day. The moment I sent the email, I felt a rush of adrenaline, a mix of excitement and nervous energy. The uncertainty that had followed me after leaving my old job seemed to fade, replaced by a new sense of purpose. This was it. The world hadn't forgotten me. It had just been waiting for me to step into it. The call the next day was a revelation. My former colleague spoke highly of the company, their culture, and their commitment to growth. But most importantly, she didn't just talk about the organization. She talked about me. She didn't just want someone who could perform tasks. She wanted someone who could bring fresh ideas, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. It felt like she was speaking directly to me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. The realization hit me hard. I wasn't just a cog in a machine anymore. I was a person with something valuable to contribute, and the right place would recognize that. After the call, I spent the next few days preparing for an interview. I updated my resume, brushed up on the company's latest projects, and reflected on everything I had learned in my previous job. I was ready for this. I wasn't just walking into an interview as a job seeker. I was walking in as someone who had a history of quietly making things work, someone who knew how to get things done even when no one was looking. I had already proved my worth. Now it was time to prove it to a new group of people who would understand it. The interview itself felt like a breath of fresh air. The questions were thoughtful, the conversation engaging. I was no longer answering questions with a sense of desperation or fear of rejection. I spoke with confidence, knowing that I was not just looking for a job, I was looking for a place where my skills and talents would be appreciated. The interview felt more like a discussion than an interrogation, and by the end of it, I was certain that this company was a place where I could thrive. A few days later, the offer came through. They wanted me on board, and they offered a salary that reflected my worth, something that had been sorely lacking in my previous position. It wasn't just about the money, though. It was about respect. I had spent so long feeling invisible, underpaid, and undervalued. Now I had found a place that saw me for what I was, capable, driven, and ready to contribute to something bigger than myself. As I read through the offer letter, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The decision I had made to leave my old job was already paying off. The world had shifted in ways I hadn't expected, but it had shifted in my favor. I had made the right choice. I had taken control of my destiny, and it was taking me somewhere new, somewhere better. The next chapter had begun, and this time I was no longer invisible. I was finally stepping into the light. The first day at the new job felt surreal. I had walked into that office, fully expecting to feel out of place, to be reminded of how it felt to be the newcomer, unsure of what to expect. But as I walked through the doors, a sense of calm washed over me. It was as if I had stepped into a space where I belonged, a place where the work was valued, where the people truly believed in collaboration. There were no empty speeches or grandiose claims about visions that never materialized. Here, the focus was on the work itself and how everyone contributed to making it happen. It was a refreshing change. My desk was in an open area with lots of natural light, surrounded by people who didn't just look like they were working, they looked like they were engaged. Conversations were happening everywhere, but they weren't the kind of superficial exchanges I had grown accustomed to. These were real, thought-provoking discussions about ideas, strategies, and solutions. I was surrounded by people who cared about the work as much as I did. For the first time in a long while, I felt energized. During the first week, I was introduced to the team and given a series of projects to jump into. Nothing felt overwhelming or unmanageable, but everything felt meaningful. Each task was approached with care, and there was an unspoken understanding that we were all in this together, working towards something bigger. I was involved in brainstorming sessions, strategic discussions, and tactical planning. I wasn't relegated to the sidelines or given menial tasks. I was part of the process. My input mattered. As the weeks went by, I realized how much I had been missing. The idea of working in a place where people weren't just doing their jobs to get by, but genuinely invested in the success of the organization, was something I had never experienced before. In my previous role, I had grown accustomed to being overlooked. My efforts, my ideas, my contributions were always secondary to the noise around me, the constant discussions about things that didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. But here, I was seen for who I was, a person with knowledge, ideas, and experience to offer. And it wasn't just the work that was different, it was the people. My new colleagues were kind, approachable, and open-minded. They didn't just tolerate my presence, they valued it. There was no hierarchy of importance. Everyone was treated with respect, regardless of their role. The leadership team, which included some of the brightest minds I had ever encountered, didn't sit behind closed doors giving orders. They were part of the conversation. They listened. They asked for input. They weren't afraid to admit when they didn't have all the answers. And when they did, they turned to the team for ideas. It was a real collaborative environment, one where my voice mattered just as much as anyone else's. I found myself becoming more confident with every passing day. The tasks I was given were challenging, but they never felt impossible. When I encountered obstacles, I wasn't expected to figure everything out alone. There were people around me who genuinely wanted to help and solve problems together. I started to realize that this was what true teamwork looked like, a shared sense of purpose, a shared commitment to doing the best work we could, and a willingness to support one another when things got tough. But the most significant shift for me was in how I viewed myself. I had spent so long feeling invisible, undervalued, and underappreciated that I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen, to be heard, to have my ideas taken seriously. But now, in this new environment, I remembered who I was. I wasn't just a cog in the machine anymore. I was a vital part of a team that recognized my strengths and encouraged me to grow. Every day, I was being challenged in ways I hadn't experienced in years, and instead of feeling drained, I felt revitalized. The projects I worked on became more fulfilling. My input was welcomed, my opinions were respected, and the results spoke for themselves. We were able to launch new initiatives, improve systems, and increase efficiency in ways that would have seemed impossible just a few months ago. But more importantly, I started to see the impact of my work. People were noticing the difference. The changes we were implementing weren't just incremental, they were transformative. One afternoon, my manager pulled me aside for a quick chat. She looked at me with a smile that felt different than any smile I had received in my old job. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "Your contributions have been invaluable. We're lucky to have you on the team." It was a simple statement, but it meant the world to me. Finally, after all this time, I felt like someone saw me. Not just as someone who did the work, but as someone whose ideas mattered, whose effort was appreciated, and whose presence made a difference. It wasn't the empty praise I had received in the past, it was genuine. And it was enough. As I left work that evening, I couldn't help but smile. I had made the right choice. Leaving that old job was the best decision I had ever made. I wasn't just moving forward in my career, I was moving forward in my life. I had finally found a place where my work had meaning, where my voice was heard, and where I could grow into the person I was always meant to be. The future was full of possibilities, and for the first time in years, I felt excited about what was to come. The journey I had started was far from over. But now I was walking it with confidence, knowing that I had finally found my place. Months passed, and with each new day I became more immersed in the work and culture at my new job. The initial excitement had settled into a steady rhythm, one that felt natural and right. I found myself looking forward to the challenges ahead, eager to contribute and make a difference in ways that felt meaningful. No longer did I feel like I was just pushing papers or filling gaps behind the scenes. I was actively shaping the future of the projects I was involved in. This was a level of engagement I hadn't realized I'd been craving for so long. There were moments, of course, when the weight of my past job tried to creep in. The insecurities, the lingering doubt, those habits of second-guessing myself and constantly wondering if I was doing enough, didn't disappear overnight. But every time I felt that old sense of invisibility rise up, I reminded myself of what I had achieved. I had taken a leap, walked away from the familiar, and built something new. And with every day I spent here, I proved to myself that I was right to make that choice. I found comfort in the small things. There were no more long, drawn-out meetings where everyone spoke just to be heard. No more pretending to care about decisions that were clearly made before anyone entered the room. Here, everyone's opinions were valued, and the decisions we made as a team carried weight. In fact, some of the best ideas came from the people who had once been considered junior staff members. People like me. It was a humbling experience, realizing how much talent was being overlooked in my previous job, all because the system didn't know how to tap into it. Now, in this new place, I saw firsthand the difference it made to treat everyone as equals and give them the space to contribute. One afternoon, I was sitting in a meeting discussing a new campaign we were about to launch. As usual, there was a lively debate about the best approach, with everyone throwing in their suggestions. For the first time, I felt truly comfortable voicing my opinion without hesitation. I suggested an alternative approach to the campaign that focused on a more direct, personalized outreach, rather than the broad strokes approach everyone had been advocating. There was a brief silence, and then someone nodded. "That's a great point," my manager said. "Let's explore that." The idea was put into action, and as the campaign unfolded, it became clear that my suggestion had been the right call. It was a success, and it felt like a quiet victory. It wasn't about recognition or praise. It was about the satisfaction of knowing I had contributed in a way that mattered. As I settled further into my role, I began to understand just how much my previous experiences had shaped me. Every late night spent working on a problem no one else cared about, every idea I had pushed to the side because it wasn't popular enough, all of that had taught me resilience. It had taught me how to work hard without expecting rewards. But it had also taught me the importance of finding a place that truly valued my work. Now I was surrounded by people who saw the potential in every contribution, no matter how small, and who celebrated the collective achievements of the team. But the biggest change I noticed was in how I began to view myself. At my old job, I had spent so much time measuring my worth based on the validation I received, or more accurately, the lack of it. I had let myself be defined by the absence of recognition, thinking that if I just worked harder, someone would eventually notice. But now I understood something fundamental. I didn't need someone else to validate me. I was enough on my own. I had always been enough. I just needed the right environment to flourish. One evening, after a particularly successful meeting, I sat in the office with a colleague who had become a close friend over the months. We were both going over final details for a presentation, and as we laughed over a small joke, I had a moment of clarity. I was finally in a place where I felt at home. The team, the work, the respect, it all aligned. I was no longer the frustrated, invisible employee I had once been. I was the person I had always known I could be, confident, capable, and seen for who I was. "I'm glad you're here," my colleague said as we wrapped up for the day. "You've really made a difference around here." I smiled, feeling the weight of those words sink in. It was the first time someone had said something like that in a long time, and it felt different. It felt real. That night, as I left the office and headed home, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. I had taken a leap, and while the journey had been difficult at times, it had been worth it. I had grown, both professionally and personally. I had learned the value of self-worth and the importance of finding a place that recognizes that value. And perhaps most importantly, I had learned that success doesn't come from being seen by others. It comes from seeing yourself and believing in your own potential. As I walked into my apartment, I realized that the next chapter of my life was no longer just about moving away from the past. It was about embracing the future. And I was ready for it, fully and completely. Months passed, and I settled deeper into my new life. The adrenaline from the initial transition had settled, and what had once felt like a leap into the unknown had become my new reality. I woke up each morning eager to tackle the day, knowing that the work I was doing was not just contributing to the success of the organization, but also to my own growth. Every project, every task was now an opportunity to improve, to challenge myself, and most importantly, to prove that I was more than capable of achieving the success I had longed for. But success, I began to realize, didn't come just from completing tasks or getting the job done. It came from knowing that I was in the right place, doing the right work, and surrounded by people who appreciated my contributions. That sense of belonging, of being truly valued for what I brought to the table, was something I had never fully understood before. I had always thought that success was about doing the right thing at the right time and getting recognized for it. But here, it was different. Success, I learned, was about finding a space where I could grow without fear of being overlooked. It wasn't long before I started taking on more responsibility. Projects that once seemed intimidating now felt like exciting challenges. My manager noticed my drive, my ability to think strategically, and my willingness to go above and beyond. And soon I was invited to lead a major initiative. It was a project that had been on the company's radar for months, but no one had quite figured out how to execute it. When I was asked to step in, I knew this was my chance to prove that I had learned everything I needed to make this project a success. At first, the pressure was intense. There were deadlines to meet, stakeholders to manage, and decisions to be made. But I had learned something crucial in the past few months. I didn't have to do everything myself. The difference between this environment and my previous job was that I didn't have to carry the burden alone. I had a team I could rely on, and they had my back just as I had theirs. We worked together, strategizing, brainstorming, and tackling each challenge with a collective sense of purpose. One afternoon, after an exhausting yet productive meeting, my team gathered around to discuss the next steps. We were all tired, but there was an air of excitement in the room. We knew that this project could be a game changer, and that feeling was contagious. As we went over the details, I found myself stepping into a leadership role I hadn't quite anticipated. I wasn't the loudest person in the room, but I was the one who kept everything organized, who made sure everyone was on track, and who saw the bigger picture. It was a role I had never imagined for myself, but one I had clearly earned. As the project progressed, I found that I wasn't just leading a team. I was learning from them. The people around me, many of whom had years more experience than I did, were eager to collaborate, to teach, and to share their expertise. It was a refreshing shift from the competitive, cutthroat environment I had left behind. Here, we were all in it together. No one was trying to outshine the other. We were all working toward the same goal, and every success, no matter how small, felt like a shared victory. I couldn't help but reflect on how different this experience was from the one I had left behind. In my old job, everything had been about survival. It was about pushing through, doing the work without any recognition, and hoping that one day someone would notice. But here the focus was on growth, collaboration, and respect. It wasn't about putting in the hours just for the sake of it. It was about putting in the effort where it mattered and knowing that your contributions were genuinely appreciated. One evening, after another late meeting, I walked out of the office feeling the familiar exhaustion that used to leave me frustrated and defeated in my old job. But this time it was different. This time, the exhaustion felt like the kind of tired you get after a long, hard workout. A tiredness that came from pushing yourself to your limits but knowing that you were making progress. I walked out into the cool night air, taking a deep breath as I looked up at the stars. I realized how far I had come in such a short time. I had left behind a place where my talents were ignored and my efforts undervalued, and I had found a home where I could thrive. I was no longer just filling a role, I was shaping the path forward. I wasn't just contributing to someone else's vision, I was building my own. When I thought back to the days of frustration and feeling invisible, I couldn't help but feel proud of how far I had come. The courage to leave, to step into the unknown, had been the catalyst for everything that had followed. It wasn't just about the job or the promotion, it was about reclaiming my own sense of self-worth. It was about refusing to accept mediocrity and choosing instead to invest in myself. The truth was, I didn't need to wait for anyone to recognize me anymore. I had recognized myself, and that, more than anything else, was the key to my success. As I continued on this journey, I knew there would be more challenges ahead. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had faced the hardest part, the leap, and now I was ready to keep moving forward, no matter where the road took me. The best part was, for the first time in a long time, I was walking that road with my head held high. As the months continued to pass, I found myself settling into a rhythm that felt right. What had once been a leap into uncertainty had become a steady path forward. I wasn't just working for the sake of getting by anymore, I was building something meaningful. Each day brought new challenges, but they didn't feel overwhelming. I was now part of a team that was supportive, collaborative, and focused on growth. My contributions were valued, and I began to trust myself more. In the midst of this new chapter, I found myself reflecting on the journey I'd taken. Leaving my previous job had felt terrifying, but now, looking back, I could see how necessary that step had been. I had left a place where I was invisible, undervalued, and frustrated. But in doing so, I had found a space where I could flourish. I had learned that self-worth doesn't come from external validation. It comes from within. I had grown professionally and personally, and I realized that the greatest success wasn't in the projects I completed or the recognition I received. It was in reclaiming my own sense of purpose and confidence. I no longer defined myself by the approval of others. The road ahead was still unknown, but for the first time in years, I was ready for whatever came next. I had built a foundation of trust in myself and my abilities, and nothing was going to shake that. As I walked into the office each day, I knew that I was no longer just surviving. I was thriving, and that made all the difference.